What were we really doing? We were manipulating time. Perhaps a little technical for you, but I'm trying to give you some idea of what we're involved in.
If that sounds impossible, good. Because impossible is usually just the part of the story we're allowed to see. And that's exactly why ideas like this feel impossible to us. Because we're not shown the full picture.
In reality, science and technology is about 50 years ahead of what is reported and taught in the usual school systems and even the best school systems. The private science being that which is restricted to only a few, to certain government agencies, to certain major private corporations that help build some of this hardware in secret.
Over the years, Al Bielek appeared in multiple documentaries, conferences, and long-form interviews, speaking in detail about programs most people have never heard of. And according to him, what started as a simple mind control project didn't stay that way. It started as mind control, but in the process, they discovered something they weren't prepared for. The human mind wasn't just responding to technology, it was interacting with reality itself. And that discovery changed everything. Because once you realize the mind can influence matter, you start asking a much more dangerous question. What is matter really made of? So stay with me, because what they uncovered next changes the scale of this entire story.
So the war was over. We captured a lot of equipment from the Germans, a lot of paperwork, a lot of patents, a lot of trade secrets. 26 railroad car loads full. It's the biggest steal in history. These refugee scientists were set up at Brookhaven to continue work which they had started during or prior to World War II, and that project was known as mind control. In other words, how can you influence the human mind and make the person, because of the influence on his mind, do what you want him to do, or forget what you want him to forget, or perhaps put in false memories. The earliest phases of this were primarily centered around the idea of controlling the person's behavior.
At first, it was framed as research, behavioral science, psychological influence. But what's rarely discussed is how much post-war technology may have originated from those captured programs. It's often said that many breakthroughs in aerospace, radar, and advanced systems can be traced back to the research brought over after World War II. Entire branches of science accelerated almost overnight. And once you understand that, the idea of secret parallel development doesn't feel so far-fetched. Because once you learn how to influence a mind, the next question isn't whether you can, it's how far you're willing to go. And eventually, someone started asking questions.
But sometime in the 60s, mid-late 60s, somebody started reading these reports. And they found that there's a project going on at Brookhaven we don't really like the sound of. This is mind control. What are they doing? So they started to look into it and get some reports back. And the Senate has their own way of gathering intelligence. And they finally became very horrified at the possibilities that they might use this on the people in the Senate or the Congress. So the orders went out to cancel the project and kick these scientists out of Brookhaven, which was done.
On paper, it was over. But when a project reaches that level of secrecy, cancellation doesn't mean destruction. It means transfer. And just a few miles east of Brookhaven, there was a place perfectly suited for that.
So what happened to them? There was a very large military base to the east of Brookhaven National Laboratories. Brookhaven is essentially central to the eastern part of Long Island. And on the extreme eastern tip, there was a military base, now abandoned, has been abandoned officially on the government records since 1969, but it was a military base operational from prior to World War I until well after the end of World War II. Officially and originally, it was known as Fort Hero, an Army base. And it had 2 underwater entrance submarine pens for the U.S. Navy's use, which are still there, but they stopped using them in 1983. And this was the base which was still there in 1947. World War II was over.
At this point, the story shifts, because up until now, everything can be explained as Cold War bureaucracy. But this is where the details stop behaving normally. The base was officially abandoned, and yet, something about the numbers didn't add up. Watch this.
And the base was carried on GSA, that's General Services Administration records, as a surplus, unused base. what a joke. It was hardly unused. And one of the other interesting sidelights was who picked up the tab for the power bill, because electric power had to be pumped in there for the research and all of these hardware which came later. And this electric bill was picked up by the New York State Parks Commission. It averaged $55,000 per month. So they consumed a little bit of power.
$55,000 a month for a base that was supposed to be empty. That's the detail that made me pause, because up until this point, you could still explain everything away as Cold War secrecy. But this feels different. And when I looked deeper into what that power was actually running, that's when the story stopped being about mind control.
They found that with the properly functioning transmitter, coupled to the mind of a human, after they got the basic groundwork solved, a person could think of an object, like a chair or a table, and the transmitter, when on and functioning, would create that object physically in 3 dimensions. Solid. You could kick it up and throw it around and do anything you wanted with it, as long as the transmitter was on. Eventually, the first phases, of course, when we turned the transmitter off, the object disappeared. They finally solved that problem so that when they turned the transmitter off, the object stayed. It was a real creation. That was one of the earlier phases of work they went through to learn what they could do with this transmitter.
If that's accurate, then the experiment wasn't about control. It was about creation. They learned the mind could create matter, but the more they pushed the transmitter, the more they realized it wasn't just affecting what exists. It was affecting when things exist. Matter and time weren't separate. And once they saw that, this was no longer a mind control project.
What were we really doing? We were manipulating time. Now, if you've ever had any idea about what time is about, perhaps you haven't been learned much about it. I'll give you a little better idea. 3 physical dimensions we all know. The 4th dimension, time, which we measure with a clock, but a 5th dimension, which is an extension of that. And you can represent time in a rather unique way called the torus of time. And this is a mathematical and visual representation. But you have time, if I use this rod to represent the flow of time as we normally measure it forward in the 4th dimension. Say, if there was no flow of time, our 3 physical dimensions would cease to exist.